Hi, welcome to my second video on the Jesus hymn in Philippians. In this video, I want to focus on the second verse in this Jesus hymn. So in the first video, we looked at the first sentence, that Jesus being in the likeness and being equal with God, but chose not to exploit it. And this is meant to be an example for us, an example for our mindset, for our attitude. So I want to bring out three things from this verse. And it states, so Jesus, being in the likeness of God and being equal with God, chose not to exploit it, but rather he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. And it says he took on this nature by being made in human likeness. So I want to draw out three things here. So the first thing to note about this hymn is its genre. It is a iconium, which is Latin for a speech of praise. So in the ancient world, they would have these things called inscriptions. And we still have this in our modern world, where if you go to a very old building, you'll see a little plaque on the side and it'll say, this building was built with the funds from this generous donor, or this famous person inaugurated this building. And in the ancient world, they have something similar going on in their inscriptions, which are essentially like one of those little plaques, but it's carved into stone. And what they would do in these inscriptions, they could be quite long, and they would actually explain who the person was that gave the funds for this building, or for this amphitheater, or for this gymnasium. And what would happen is that they would use short little Greek phrases in ascending order to describe this person. And usually it would start from the least incredible things to the most incredible things about this person. And we actually see Paul use this type of speech later in Philippians 3. So if we flick over to Philippians 3 verses 4 to 6, we see that he uses this type of language again. He says, "If someone thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless." And so we see that there's this ascending order. It starts with that he is born and circumcised, and then what tribe he is born into, things that Paul can't control. And it ascends to, that he was a Pharisee, that he persecuted the church, and then that he was faultless before the law. And we know obviously that Paul then says, "I consider this all rubbish, a liability for the sake of knowing Jesus." But it's interesting just to note this ascending order. Now, this is sometimes called a race to honor, a race to status, a race to reputation. But what we see in the Philippian hymn is something different. It's an inverse race to honor. Instead of Jesus trying to gain more and more and more and take his status and use it as an advantage, rather, this Jesus hymn is a race to shame, a race to humiliation. So what we need to initially recognize is that Jesus is set up as almost like a king, in the likeness, in the position of a king, and he has this incredible race to shame. And so what we see is that there is this descent. Rather than an ascent, there is this descent, this race to shame. Now, the second thing to note about this is that Jesus chooses to do this of his own accord. And Paul actually uses reflexive pronouns. It's a fancy grammatical term, which essentially means Jesus chose to lower himself, right? This isn't something that just happens to Jesus. Jesus isn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, this is something that Jesus chooses to do. He chooses to empty himself. He chooses to lower himself. It's not something that he's manipulated into. This is something that Jesus chooses to do. Now, again, some theologians will have these big old discussions about what does it mean that Jesus emptied himself, or that Jesus made himself nothing, and they'll ponder the mysteries of the incarnation. But again, here, remember that the sort of metaphysical understanding of Jesus isn't in view here. What's in view is social standing. And so it's not that Jesus empties himself, but that he lowers himself, that he he chooses to lower himself to the position of a doulos or a doulou in the Greek. And that leads us to the third point, that Jesus lowers himself to the position of a slave. Now, some English translations will tell you, for instance, like the NIV, that this is a servant. And the Greek word doulos can mean both. It can mean slave, but it can also mean servant. And so it's a little bit unclear just from that word what position Jesus lowers himself to. But there's an indication in the text that yes, this is Jesus lowering himself to the position of a slave. And there's two indications. The first is that this language of obedience is connected to slavery. And secondly, death on a cross was the slave's punishment. That is how you punished treacherous slaves. And so it's quite clear here that Jesus is lowered to the position of a slave. And it's quite interesting that Jesus, although being in the likeness of God, lowers himself to the likeness of a slave. And this is the most incredible lowering that could be imaginable. The most incredible fall that we could see. He was in the likeness of God, at the position of a king, at the highest ranking person in the entire world. And it says he lowers himself to being in the likeness of a slave. There is not a greater descent known in our social world, or in Paul's social world, than going from a king to a slave. Now, there's a couple of other important things to note. The first is that this is the only time in Paul's letters where Jesus is called a slave. So it's quite shocking, it's quite jarring, because Paul doesn't anywhere else describe Jesus as a slave, but he does here. And it's interesting, actually, at the start of Philippians, in Philippians 1:1, Paul introduces himself and Timothy as slaves of Christ. Now, this is the only time in all of Paul's letters where he introduces himself only as a slave of Christ. Sometimes he'll introduce himself as an apostle. Others, it will be a slave of Christ and an apostle of Christ. But it is in Philippians, and only in Philippians, where Paul introduces himself as a slave. So I'm hoping you're starting to see the connection here, that Jesus is lowering himself to the position of a slave, and Paul and Timothy are slaves of Christ. The second thing we should note is that Paul and Timothy are described as serving as slaves in Philippians 2 verse 22. And again, some of our English translations will sort of mute this out. They'll just say, Timothy, who has served with me, being Paul, for Christ. But in fact, actually, the word in Greek is, Timothy has been serving as a slave with me for Christ. And so yes, Jesus lowers himself to the position of a slave, and this is imitated by Paul and Timothy. Paul and Timothy are slaves of Christ, and they are continually serving as slaves for Christ. And so when we consider what this means for us, I'm reminded of a couple verses after this Jesus hymns, where Paul says to the Philippians to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And what Paul is saying here is that we are to work out the implications of our salvation interpersonally. The word is, this working out is among you. So we have our salvation, and we are working out the implications of this salvation between one another within the church. And so this is, I think, our application for this video, that we see this incredible descent, that Jesus, being in the likeness and being equality with God, does not consider that something to be used to his own advantage, but lowers himself to the position of a slave. And this is, remember, how does he introduce this Philippians hymn? Have the same mindset in you that is in Christ Jesus. So this lowering that we see Jesus do is something that we are meant to imitate. And we're meant to imitate it, Paul says, with fear and trembling. That this salvation that we have, we are to work out among one another with fear and trembling. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, a question. I would really love that if you could do that down below, and consider sharing it on your social media. Thanks.